Hello everyone and welcome to another video. UI is the first impression that players get of your game. So you want to make a good first impression. In this video, I'd like to show how I created the story menu for a game I made for the Game Dev TV Game Jam. As you can see, there's a storyboard and a button labeled Next. When we click the button, a transition plays and the next storyboard is revealed. Let's begin. I'll be using Godot 4.2.2 for this demonstration. As you can see, I have an open empty scene here. First, let's set up the project. We go to Project, Project Settings. Under the General tab, we go to Window, and I'll change the viewport height and width to match the size of the game I want to make. Next, I change the stretch mode to canvas items. Under the advanced settings, I will click always on top because I want the game view to always be on top, which is a handy feature, and I want to override the game window to 1920 by 1080. Let's close this menu off for now. Next, I want to add a control node. We can do this by clicking the user interface button. Notice that when the control node is added, the stretch mode is set to full rect. We can rename the control node to story transition. Next, let's add a color rect node to hold our transition. We will add it as a child of the story transition node. We click on the plus button, search for the color rect node, and click create. Then we will set its anchor presets to full rect. In the inspector, we can change the color to black. We will use a shader to create the transition. However, creating a shader from scratch can be really complicated. So, what I will do is go to godotshaders.com and we'll use one of the many shaders they have available for free on there. We will use this simple 2D transition shader that was created by GraceMate. I will put a link to it in the description. Now let's begin creating our shader. In the inspector, we go to the materials, and in the drop-down, we select a new shader material. We then click on the shader and create a new shader. We can call this shader Transition Shader. Let's create a new folder to save the transition shader. We can see that this creates a new folder called Shaders. Now we click on the shader editor. Next, we go back to the shader click on copy and simply paste the shader into the shader editor. Right away we can see that there's a problem. This happens because many of these shaders were created long before the current version that we're using. This shader was created on February 5th, 2021. So you may have to do some tweaking to the code. After some Google searching, I found to fix this, we need to change the hint color to source color. And just like that, our error is fixed. Before we move on, let's save the scene. We can create a new folder called Scenes and save the scenes in there. Now back to the shader. In the material, under shader parameters, we see that 3 fields have been created: fill, color, and height map. I have created height maps using Krita and stored them in an art folder. Let's bring them into the project. With the root folder selected, I simply drag the art folder into the file system. In the art folder, I have the texture art which I will use. Let's use the swirl pattern. We simply drag the swirl into the height map field. Now in the fill field, we can move the slider, and when we move the slider, we see that the fill is being adjusted accordingly. We will use this to apply the transition. Just a quick note on choosing or creating your art. It's important that your art have some sort of gradient in order for the transition to run smoothly. We will use an animation player node to play our transition. To create an animation, we click on Animation, click New, and give a name to our animation. I'll call it Fade In. With the color Rect selected, we add a new keyframe. I will make the animation about 1 second long. So we move the playhead to 1 second and add another keyframe. Now when we play the animation, we can see that the transition is being played. Let's change our texture back to the swirl pattern. With the transition complete, let's add the storyboards. To do this, with the story transition node selected, we add a new Sprite 2D node. Let's rename it to Storyboard. And move it so that it's above the color Rect in the tree. Next, we add the storyboard art to the texture field in the inspector and uncheck centered. If we select the color Rect and adjust the fill, we can see that the transition is being played above the storyboard. Another thing to note is that when creating the texture art, they should be the same size of the game window. Now let's duplicate the storyboards a couple times and replace the textures with the appropriate storyboards. I think that a great way to show the story would be to toggle the visibility of the storyboards on and off at the appropriate times. And we can use buttons to cycle through the storyboards. Let's add our first button. With the story transition selected, we click Add and add a button. Let's rename this to Next Button. In the inspector, we change the text to Next. In the theme overrides, we can adjust the fonts. Let's add a new font from the system. We can also adjust the font size. I'll set it to 40. Next, we change the anchor presets to the bottom right. Let's play the game to see how that looks. I think that we should adjust its position. To do this is really simple. We go to the layout, transform, and adjust its transform. Now let's create the back button. To do this is really simple. We just duplicate the next button, rename it, and position it to the bottom left. Let's also change the label. Another thing that we can do is go back to the color Rect and make sure that the mouse does not interact with it. To do this, we go to the filter and change it to Ignore. With that done, all we need to do is add a script to the story transition and begin to edit our code. I will save the script in a new folder called scripts. First, let's grab a reference to the animation player by clicking and dragging it into the script and holding the Control key and releasing. This will create an onReady variable that connects the animation player to the script. Next, we will need two variables, one for the current sprite index and another variable that will be a sprites array. In the ready function, we will play the fade-in animation. Let's test that out to see how it looks. If we play the game, we can see that the game asks us to confirm a main scene. Let's select the current scene. Now we can see that the animation plays as soon as the game is loaded. In the ready function, let's collect all the sprites in the array. We can do this by simply dragging the storyboard sprites into the array. We will separate each one with a comma. With that done, we'll use a for loop to hide all the sprites as the game starts. Then, show the first sprite. Let's toggle the visibility of the storyboard 1 off to show that this is working. We won't be using the process delta function, so let's remove it for now. Let's now connect an on-button press signal for each of the buttons to the script. In the inspector, we go to the node, select the pressed signal and click connect. Then we choose the story transition script. We can see that an on next button pressed signal is connected. Let's do the same for the back button. First, let's play the animation when the button is pressed. Next, let's hide the current sprite that's selected in the array. And finally, let's update the index to the next sprite. We will do this by simply adding 1 to the current sprite index. And lastly, let's show the current sprite. Now let's save the game and test it out. We can see that the game works fine, but when we get to the end of the array, we are faced with an error. To fix this, we will check if the current sprite index is equal to the size of the array. And if it's equal to the size of the array, we will set the current sprite index equal to the size of the array minus 1. Let's play the game to see if this fixed the problem. We can see that when we play the game and we get to the last storyboard, if we click the next button, there's no error. Now for the back button, we can copy this code and paste it in the on back button pressed signal. We will need to make a couple changes. The first change is that we will need to minus 1 instead of adding 1 to the current sprite index. And for the out of bounds check, we will check if the current sprite index is less than or equal to 0, then we will set the current sprite index equal to 0. Now let's play the game and test it out. We can see that everything works fine. Now let's add a click sound to the button. To do this, we'll add an AudioStreamPlayer Node. I will just drag the sound that I have into the file system. Next, with the AudioStreamPlayer Node selected, we can drag the click effect into the stream field in the inspector. Next, we get a reference to it in the script by clicking and dragging it into the script and holding the Control key and releasing to add an onReady variable to the script. To play the sound, we just call the play function on the click sound when the button is pressed. We will do the same for the back button. Let's play the game to test it out. There's just one thing I would like to address. You see, when we get to the end of the story, we're still able to click the next button. We will create a bool canPlayAnim and set it equal to true. We will use this bool to determine whether we can play the animation or not. In the onNextButton pressed function, we will check if canPlayAnim is true, and then we will play the animation just before we show the current sprite. At the point in our code where we check if the sprite index is going out of bounds, we can set the canPlayAnim equal to false, and use an else statement to set the canPlayAnim equal to true if the current sprite index is within the bounds. While we're at it, let's only play the click sound if we can play the animation. Let's test the game to see this in action. Now let's take a look at the onBack button pressed function. We will play the animation in a similar way. We will only play the animation if canPlayAnimation is true, and play the animation just before we show the sprite. But here things are a bit different. We will do the checks to see if we can play the animation or not before we check for out of bounds. We will use an if statement to check if the current sprite index is less than 0, and set the canPlayAnim equal to false, and use an else if statement to check if the current sprite index is greater than or equal to 0, and set the canPlayAnim equal to true. While we're at it, let's also only play the click sound if we can play the animation. Now let's test this to see it in action. While this works perfectly fine, I think that we can refactor this code even further. Let's create a play transitions animations function. In this function, we will check if the current sprite index is equal to the size of the array, or if the current sprite index is less than 0, then we will set the canPlayAnim equal to false. Else we will set the canPlayAnim equal to true. It is very important where we call this function for this to work correctly. In the onNextButton pressed function, we can comment this code out and call the play transition animation function just as we add one to the sprite index. Similarly, we can comment this section of code out here and call the play transition animations function. Let's test the game to see this in action. Similarly, we can remove this line here and just set it plus equal to 1. And remove this line here and set this to minus equal 1. If you found the video useful, why not give it a like and subscribe, because it really gives me encouragement to keep making videos. Thanks for watching. This has been Deragu Games.